Welcome to our video setup tutorial for PFaroe pension liabilities. This video is intended for US PFaroe users. Our goal is to walk through a quick setup guide for the PFaroe liability model using our PFaroe Alpha or cashflow method and for a relatively straightforward pension plan. The intended audience is new PFaroe users, first-time setup users, or those in need of a refresh on the setup process. This video is current as of PFaroe release 2.77 or July 2017. Note that there are separate videos in our user guide outlining 1. The setup of plan assets, 2. The setup of the PFaroe payment schedule, and 3. The setup of more advanced liability structures, including cash balance and pension equity plans. Let's proceed. Now, before you can begin, populating a baseline PFaroe liability model in PFaroe Alpha requires the user to have on hand 5 things. Number 1, a cash flow profile at a point in time, and preferably split between actives, terminated vesteds, and retirees. This can usually be collected from the plan actuary or the plan sponsor. Number 2, liability present values, and again, a split by participant type is preferred. Number 3, an understanding of the discount rate used and the methodology employed by the actuary in determining that rate. Number 4, if the plan is still subject to ongoing accruals, an accrual cash flow profile, or at the very least, a single normal cost figure. And number 5, for optional and additional outputs in the PFaroe ALM module for regulatory cash requirements, accounting benefit costs, and or PBGC premiums, a few additional inputs, which we'll outline shortly. Note that Risk First has some useful templates that capture the input requirements in more detail, which can also be useful for sharing in PFaroe data requests. Please contact our support team for more detail if interested. After you've collected all required information, it's time to begin inputting that information. In PFaroe, navigate to Setup Liabilities Setup Alpha. This opens the Manage Alpha Headers page. If this is a brand new client, this page will be blank when you first navigate to it. If it is not, it will contain all of the headers the user has previously set up. Now, a liability header is an important PFaroe concept. A header effectively defines one liability basis at one point in time for all PFaroe analytics that are produced from it. A single plan might have 3 or more liability headers at a single point in time. For instance, 1 for accounting or US GAAP liabilities, 1 for funding or PPA liabilities, and 1 for PBGC liabilities. These would all be defined at one date, for instance, December 31, 2016. When updating for a new year at December 31, 2017, the user would then likely create 3 additional headers for that plan using new cash flows, modified economic assumptions, etc. So to create a new header, click Create New. Select Plan, if your PFaroe client has more than one. Define the liability basis name, and set the effective date. The basis type refers to the default assumptions which the header will be initially populated. For instance, the accounting US GAAP basis type will populate the discount assumptions using the Citigroup curve and allow for the input of additional fields relating to the calculation of US GAAP benefit cost, such as EROA assumptions, gain-loss amortization methods, etc. Funding not at risk will allow for additional US funding inputs, including the use of the IRS segment or full yield curve, BBA corridors, and the input of related minimum required contribution and credit balance fields. Liability effective dates in PFaroe are recommended to be defined at month-end dates. This is true even if the actual liability definition is the first of the month. For instance, January 1, 2017 should always be defined as December 31, 2016. The description field is an optional but encouraged entry. It becomes especially helpful as the plan accumulates lots of headers over time. After defining the header's initial characteristics, you'll be taken to the Alpha Header Wizard, which will help walk you through the setup process. We will begin the setup overview on the Cash Flows tab. Note that there are many helpful descriptions on each page of the wizard that we highly recommend you read, as they will both help your understanding of the setup process as well as prevent common mistakes. Here, you have the option to create a new cash flow set or load an existing one from the same client. If this is the first header being created in the client, you must use the Create New button. Note that cash flow sets can be shared between headers in the same PFaroe client, so each is associated with a name and a description. You might define these fields as illustrated. The inflation reference month and first pension increase date are only relevant for liabilities with post-retirement indexation embedded in the plan. If your plan has none, these fields can be ignored, as the entries will have no impact on the calculations. Next, let's click to add a cash flow to the cash flow set. There are many options here, defined in detail in our online reference guides, allowing the user to bypass having a cash flow profile entirely by using our sensitivity input options, or to create more highly sophisticated two-dimensional cash flow profiles. For now, we will simply paste from Excel. Here, select the participant type, add in a description if you like, and set the pre- and post-retirement indexation types if relevant. In this demo, we will assume our cash flows have no sensitivities. For example, this could be a unit credit or career average pay plan, so our indexations will be set to none. These indexations become very relevant if you are defining a salary-sensitive or interest rate-sensitive cash flow profile, such as for open final average pay plans or for cash balance plans. When these cash flow parameters are defined, simply copy and paste your cash flows into PFaroe. If your cash flows are split by participant type as we recommend, proceed again for defining the other cash flow sets. If you do not have these splits, simply input all cash flows as an active participant type. For non-frozen plans, an accrual or normal cost cash flow profile is also required. These can be provided directly if the accrual cash flow profile itself is available, or approximated using other input methods, such as simple accrual or generate from sensitivities. After these cash flows are input, the graph will populate the cash flows split by past service and accruals. Further down, some sense check figures are available for liability present value and duration to help you gauge whether there are issues in your setup. You can adjust the discount rate field to help you check the inputs, but please note that this single discount rate is not used in the actual production of liability analytics in PFaroe. When you are satisfied with your entries, proceed to the next tab, which is the Economics page. The Economics tab is used to define the economic expressions for discounting and rolling forward the cash flows provided in the previous tab. This is a very customizable page, allowing for some rather complex structures to be defined. Python expressions are used for ultimate flexibility. There's lots of documentation available on setting up expressions in the online user guide. This video will outline a basic setup using some PFaroe default assumption sets. Like with cash flows, you have the option here to create a new set or to load an existing set. For first-time users, we're going to recommend loading an existing set. Based on your header's liability basis type, there will be one or more system defaults available. For instance, in this accounting US GAAP basis type, we will select the system default titled Citigroup Curve with daily adjustment. Upon selecting this assumption set, the various Python expressions used to define that set will be set out below, currently in an uneditable state. There are inputs for discount rates, segment curve options, which is relevant for those plans using IRS segment rates, interest crediting rates, and inflationary increases. Each of these rates will also appear graphically for your visual reference, split by historic and future projected forward rates. Because we have defined this plan with no embedded indexations or sensitivities, other than for discount rates, we will only focus on the discount expression for now. Here, as the Python expression reads, this formula uses the Citigroup curve, with daily adjustments using our LLCAYW index, which is a Barclay's long yield to worst index used to approximate daily movements in the Citigroup curve. If you wish to adjust the default assumptions, click to edit the assumption set, and then rename it appropriately and with a relevant description. Now you can do things like change the curve reference or add spreads, as illustrated. Again, because the expression building is defined using Python mechanics, there's considerable flexibility available. When you are satisfied, proceed to the Other Liability tab. We also recommend you save your header at this point. On this page, a few additional liability definitions are available. First, you can designate if the plan is open or closed. And if the plan is closed, you can designate the future accrual decay factors. Note that the PFaroe default decay factors are provided if you do not wish to customize this setting. For now, we will skip the usage of past service expenses as they are unlikely to be relevant for U.S. plans in the majority of cases. Note that this entry does not correspond to the expense load for U.S. GAAP service cost calculations. Further, if your plan has pre- or post-retirement indexations defined, an option called Advanced Modeling Approach will be available. We will not cover that in this video. The calibration page allows PFaroe setup users to calibrate to an initial liability present value. This is useful when it is important that PFaroe tie into the initial value as determined by the actuary and disclosed in the actuarial valuation report or year-end disclosure. There are two primary methods available to perform this calibration. First, calibration via adjusting the discount curve. This is covered in the first and second radio buttons following the no calibration radio button. The first allows different spreads to be applied by participant type. The second creates a single spread for all participant types. The second option is calibration by modifying the cash flows. The final radio button will create a modified cash flow set rather than adjusting the discount curve. When this option is selected, a pop-out will appear upon attempting to navigate to the next tab, allowing you to accept or reject the calibration. Accepting the cash flow modification will replace the original cash flows used, so we recommend taking caution with this approach. The risk page will translate the economic assumptions defined in the economics page into formats understood by GEMS, or the economic scenario generator PFaroe uses to create stochastic liability output in the risk and ALM modules. For instance, in this setup, there is no Citigroup curve defined within GEMS, so we need to mirror Citigroup by using expressions that are available in the ESG. For this accounting basis type, the default is that Citigroup is represented as 100% of a AA bond curve. For other basis types, such as funding not at risk, the IRS curve default will be represented as a blend of AAA, AA, and single A corporate bond curves out of the ESG. Note that it is very likely that you will need to modify these assumptions. Further down and not covered in this video are options to define the stochastic settings for interest crediting rates and inflationary increases. The ALM tab allows different assumptions to be applied if desired for ALM studies, but the default is to use the same expressions as defined on the risk tab. Again, it is unlikely this default will need to be changed. Depending on your liability basis type, there may or may not be an other ALM page in your header setup wizard. Specifically, there are additional entries required for the accounting US GAAP basis type and the funding not at risk basis type. The US GAAP entries relate to the calculation of US GAAP accounting costs in the PFaroe ALM module. It includes entries such as prior service cost bases, gain-loss amortization methods, and EROA assumptions. The funding not at risk entries relate to the calculation of regulatory cash contributions, as well as the usage of credit balances to pay for those contributions. It includes entries such as shortfall amortization bases, credit balance election policies, and at-risk load assumptions. Also, it's important to note that the funding not at risk basis type is a prerequisite to defining the PBGC basis type, as certain inputs are required for both in order to work properly in the ALM module. The Preview tab is very useful for getting further sense checks of your liabilities prior to publishing them. On this screen is a preview date which defaults to the as of date of your header, a graph of the annual liability cash flows, and some summary statistics. The PV breakdown shows the liability present value by participant type. If there is a calibration used in the header, the before and after effective calibration will be outlined. This is a very useful gauge of smell testing the cash flows and assumptions as previously defined. On occasion, a moderate to large deviation from the pre-calibration results should be expected, such as when calibrating an accounting liability from the PFaroe default Citigroup curve to the results of that use from a highly cherry-picked bond model from the plan actuary. On the other hand, when calibrating to a funding liability where the economic assumptions are prescribed, the calibration should be relatively small, hopefully something less than 2 to 3%. Note that calibration impacts will never be zero, as methodology and timing differences are always apparent between PFaroe and another evaluation platform. The discount spread is another useful pre- and post-calibration feature to view, as it shows the results of the spread applied to the defined discount curve required to reach the present values defined in the calibration tab. As you will see, for this example, we're looking at a plan that doesn't have an adequate calibration applied to it. We're seeing spreads to the discount curve of nearly 4% for each of the participant types, which would clearly be unacceptable and a cause to go back and revisit either the cash flows input or the assumptions defined for the plan. And finally, some additional statistics, such as the single effective discount rate, duration, and convexity are available. Note that previews can be requested at dates subsequent to the header date by adjusting the preview date accordingly. When you are satisfied, let's move on to the Publish tab. The Final tab outlines the publishing options available to PFaroe users. Note that publishing is split by month-end date and the three primary PFaroe calculations, one for valuations, one for risk, and one for ALM data. In the typical usage case, valuation data is published for all months, risk data is published for select months and the most recent month, and ALM data is only published on the as-of date of an asset liability study. Valuation and risk data can be published in an ongoing sense, such that as time elapses and the relevant market data becomes available in PFaroe, data is published without any user intervention otherwise. Daily valuations are also available to be published on this screen, and the user can select the start and end dates of the daily valuation figures to be prepared. Publishing information in PFaroe is best accomplished with a multi-step method. First, the user will publish valuation information, and only valuation information, at the as-of date of the liability header. Second, the user will then navigate to the PFaroe payment schedule and complete the setup of that payment schedule. And third, the user will then return to this page and publish all subsequent valuation, risk, and ALM information as needed. Daily valuations can also be published at this point in time. This process is very important as the results of rolled forward liabilities will use information from the payment schedule in determining the new values. Note that a brief video is also available outlining the usage and setup of the PFaroe payment schedule. Now that you've created your first header, let's review a few supplementary topics. First, you can track the publishing process of your liabilities via the Setup Tracking page in PFaroe. Second, on the Manage Alpha Headers page, you have a few options with respect to your new header. If any information has been published, your header's status will be locked. If nothing has been published, it will be unlocked. If the header is unlocked, you can make further edits to it. You will only be able to view locked headers. You can also copy headers for creating additional basis types, for future date updates, or for making changes. A CSV of the input information can be downloaded for review. And finally, you can delete headers and all respective data. This is a powerful feature and cannot be undone, so use this with caution. Finally, please note a few additional helpful tips. You can use a single cash flow profile to create multiple liability headers. For instance, you can use a single set of accounting cash flows to approximate funding, termination, economic, and PBGC liabilities, while it is more sophisticated to use different cash flows by basis type, as for instance, different mortality tables may be embedded in the assumptions depending on the basis type. The power of being able to show many different angles on the plan from limited information is a premier PFaroe capability. To do this, simply create a new header and reference a previously created cash flow set in the Cash Flow tab. Further maintenance of liability headers is available in Setup Liabilities Manage. Related maintenance of risk and ALM liability runs are available in Setup Risk Manage and Setup ALM Manage. Although the initial publishing of daily liability valuation is available in the header's publish screen, you can maintain and adjust the available daily information in the Setup Liabilities Setup Daily screens. Further, for using liabilities in PFaroe's Daily Analytics module, certain additional information will need to be created in the Setup Manage Daily Metrics page. For most information to appear in the Analytics tabs in PFaroe, there will need to be assets defined at subsequent dates. For instance, to view the dashboard at June 30th, 2017, both assets and liabilities need to be made available at that date. Please see our related video on setting up and managing the assets in PFaroe. Thank you for watching. For more information, please see our in-depth reference guides in the online user guide, especially those under Setting Up PFaroe Liabilities and Setting Up PFaroe Combined. The latter has a detailed walkthrough on using the payment schedule effectively in PFaroe. Please reach out to the Risk First support desk with any further questions at support@riskfirst.com.